Hilchos Shabbos, Perek Shmini, Laws of Shabbos, Chapter 8. Yesterday in Chapter 7 we got the list of the 39 Avot Melachot, 39 primary forbidden labors on the Shabbos. Starting today and for the next many chapters, the Rambam will go Melacha by Melacha, labor by labor, in the order that he gave it yesterday, and define many more parameters and many more derivatives of each and every one of the 39 Melachot. It's not exactly clear how the Rambam chose to divide the coming chapters. Like, for example, yesterday we saw that the first 11 Melachot are Sidurat de Pat, the order of creating bread. But when it comes to defining the Melachot, the Rambam spends this chapter today on the first 10, and the 11th one he leaves for tomorrow. And commentaries have tried to understand why exactly and how the Rambam divided the chapters, but nevertheless, it remains curious. And as we're studying the Rambam himself, we're just going to go right for the text and get involved in understanding the first 10 of the 39 Melachot in today's chapter, chapter 8. So here we go. We begin with Charisha. The very first Melacha is the Melacha of plowing. You're not allowed to plow a field in preparation for the planting. Says the Rambam, Halacha Aleph HaChoresh Kol Shehu. One who plows even the minutest amount. You overturn a tiny bit of earth, Chayav, you're already liable. And now, let's talk about things that are related to plowing. Hamenakesh bi'ikrei ha'ilanot. Somebody who weeds at the roots of trees. Typically at the roots of trees, you can see here, many weeds can grow, and it's important to once in a while go around and weed them. So the weeding could be considered an act of plowing. V'hamekarsem asavim, same thing that Rambam says, cutting the tops of tall grass. O hamezared et hasarigim, or somebody who prunes shoots, young trees, he prunes them, and all of this is being done kedei liyapot et hakarka, in order to beautify the land. Harei zeh toledet choresh, then it would be a derivative of plowing. The commentaries explain, if you would do it with a different intent, if you would do it to help it grow, you're pruning or you're weeding to help the tree grow, now you're already in the category of zoreya, of planting. Some commentaries even say if you were doing it with the intent of reaping, you wanted the weeds for yourself, you wanted the pruned shoots for yourself, now you're in the realm of kotzer, now you're in the realm of reaping. A whole different melacha. Here we're talking about specifically where your goal is to beautify the earth. And when it's to beautify the earth, you're doing melacha with the earth, which is a derivative of plowing. The same way for plowing itself, you're liable as soon as you plow the minutest amount. Same thing for these other three things. As soon as you do the minutest amount, you're already liable. The same applies to somebody who levels the face of a field. Somebody takes a mound of earth and flattens it. Yeah, quite a tall mound there. He's got quite a job ahead of him, but he flattens it till he makes it level with the level of the field. O milei hagai, or he fills a hole, also creating an earth that's now level. Chayav mishum choresh, this also makes you accountable on account of choresh, a plower. V'shiuro kol shu, and like the plower, all you have to do is the minutest amount. V'chen kol hamashveh gumo, the same thing is true of anybody who levels holes and levels the ground that way. Shiuro kol shu, the amount that makes him liable is the minutest amount. Here the Rambam specifically talks about somebody leveling in the field, because we're going to see later on in chapter 10 that when you do it in your house, there's a different melacha that you're violating. You're violating the melacha of boneh, of building. Here, choresh is only in the field. Halacha bet, now we move on to the second melacha, the melacha of zri'ah, of planting. Hazoreya, when it comes to planting, also the amount that makes you liable is kol shehu, chayab. Even the minutest amount. You plant one seed, a whole tree can grow. All you need is one seed to make the labor constructive. And therefore you're obligated for the minutest amount. One who prunes a tree in order that it should grow. That's your example right there of somebody pruning a tree. And again, here you see the intent is not to beautify the earth, it's to make the tree grow. That puts you in the resembling category of zoreya. Yesterday we saw some melachot are considered to be in the same topic. They're like the father, on the same level as the father, and some are called toladot, derivatives. The me'ein melacha, this is a case of pruning. Pruning is a case of me'ein melacha. But if you're simply watering the plants or trees on Shabbos, now you're not considered to actually be planting, you're considered to be a derivative of planting. Some people say because you're not actually dealing with the plants, you're not actually dealing with the earth, you're simply pouring water over the plants. So it puts you in the category of zoreya because you're enhancing the growth of the plant, but it's not actual planting, so it's only a derivative. Somebody who soaks wheat kernels, barley kernels, anything like it in water. We call this today hydroponics. You can make things actually sprout in the water. We can't call it literal planting, it's not in the earth, but it's a derivative of planting. And you'll also be obligated, liable for punishment on account of the minutest amount that you put into this hydroponic plant. Halakha Gimel, now we move to the third melacha, ktsira, reaping. And here the Rambam makes a notable change. And he says, Hakotzer ki grogeret chayav. When you're reaping, you have to harvest the amount of a dried fig. Why? We're going to see elsewhere in halacha, the size of a dried fig is the size of shiur achila, the amount that's fit for somebody to eat. Other times we say it's a kazayit, an olive size, but usually when it comes to Yom Kippur, other things, we have the idea of grogeret, of a dried fig. So since the purpose of harvesting is to eat, so you have to harvest enough that would allow you to eat. When it comes to plowing and planting, all you have to do is something that makes plowing and planting important, which is a minute amount, even a tiny amount. When it comes to harvesting, you have to have the size of a grogeret. And now, says the Rambam, let's get some derivatives of the melacha of cutting. V'tolesh, somebody who plucks. He's not harvesting with a sickle or with a utensil. He is doing it with his hands. Toledet kotzerhu. It's a derivative of reaping. Anybody who uproots something from the place that it nurtures and grows, chayav mishum kotzer, is also liable on account of reaping. Therefore, if you have a pebble or a rock upon which grass grew, ukshut sha'ala bisneh, or if you have a parasitic plant, a fruit that grew onto a thorn bush. This is an example over here. You see a thorn bush that grew these lumpy yellow fruits that were parasitic. And if you have grass that grew on top of a barrel, these are also nourishing at this point in time from these bushes, from these places. Hatolesh mehen chayav, and therefore you plucking them from their roots also makes you accountable, liable. You're not reaping from the ground. You're reaping from a rock, from a barrel, from a thorn bush. Doesn't matter. You're plucking something from the place where it's growing. Shezehu mekom gidulan, because right now this is the place of their growth. Aval hatolesh me'atzitz she'eino naku, but were you to pluck something from a flower pot on the left here, which does not have a hole, so it's kind of self-contained, it isn't growing from any sort of ground, patur, you're exempt. That isn't the place of growth. Plants don't grow in soil in flower pots. They grow in soil on the ground. You happen to move over the soil into a flower pot, and now it's growing over here. Therefore, you're exempt. Remember that in Hilchos Shabbat, patur means still asur. Still forbidden, but you're exempt from punishment. But on the other hand, were the flower pot to have even the tiniest hole for a small root to get through, that would qualify it as earth, and the moment you pluck something from that flower pot, you would now be obligated, liable for punishment. Halakha Dalet, says the Rambam, Kol zera, any time that you have a plant or a growing thing, that when you cut it, it actually enhances its growth. Aspasta v'silka. For example, what's called cattle grass and beets. Cattle grass you have on the left, it's not a specific category of grass. It's any grass that animals are comfortable to graze on. They're usually pretty tall. And if when you cut it, it actually helps it grow back faster. Same with beets. You cut beets, those grasses, those leaves, they grow back even faster. So now, if you reap it on Shabbos inadvertently, you're going to be accountable on two counts. One because you're reaping, and a second because you're actually planting, you're enhancing the growth. Same thing would apply if you were pruning a shoot. And you also needed to have the wood, like I gave the example before in the first halacha, chayav mishum kotzer mishum notea. You'd be liable on two counts again, for reaping and for planting. Gav shushit shel afar, she'alu ba'asavim. Let's say you have a clod of earth upon which grass grew. Higbiha me'al ha'aretz v'hinichal gabei tedot. Pretty primitive picture here, but you get the idea. You have a clod of earth. On the clod is growing grass. You took it out of the ground, out of the place of its growth, and put it onto poles. Chayav mishum tolesh. At the moment that you plucked it out of the ground, you're obligated, you're liable on account of plucking. If the opposite was true, it began in the position of the poles and you put it into the ground. Chayav mishum zoreya. For the opposite act, you're liable for a whole different melacha, the melacha of planting, because now by putting it back in the ground, you're enhancing its growth. Let's say you had figs that dried in their fruit, in their growth, on the tree. The figs dried on the tree. Or another tree upon whom its fruits died. On the left, on the right, you have an apple tree. The apples just simply dried out. Even though they're dry, and typically the melacha of kotzer would be to reap something from the place of its growth. Now these fruits aren't growing. Says the Rambam, nevertheless, if you pluck them on Shabbos, you're liable. Even though in other areas of Jewish legality, when it comes to impurity, and we're going to see certain times in order for fruit or produce to be susceptible to becoming impure, it has to be detached from the ground. And this already qualifies as detached when it comes to laws of impurity. When it comes to laws of Shabbat, they're still considered attached. Says the Rambam now, even though until now I've been telling you that the amount to make you liable for ktsira is kigrogeret, the size of a dried fig, that's only for things that are typically eaten. Halacha hey hatolesh ulshin, were you to pluck an endive plant, that's an endive plant right there, and in the corner you see the actual endives, that little oval-shaped onion family. Hamizared zradin, and also somebody who prunes moist shoots, im lachila, if you did it with the purpose of eating, then indeed, shiuro kigrogeret, the amount that will hold you liable is a dried fig, because the purpose is to eat it. But if you cut it with the intention of feeding it to your animal, now you have to go and see what's an important amount for an animal. Shiuro kimlo pigdi, says the Rambam, the amount that holds you liable is when you cut the amount that will fill the mouth of a goat who typically eats this type of stuff. Maybe you have a third option. Maybe you cut the endive plant or the shoots to use as firewood. So then in that case, you have to cut enough that will help you to cook an egg. Because cooking an egg is the minimum amount that's required when we talk about the area of firewood and cooking. Now, the Rambam moves over to the fourth melacha in middle of a halacha, quite unusual. The melacha of imur, of gathering produce. After you reap it, you have a bunch of loose stalks of grain. Now you have to gather them in and make bundles. Says the Rambam, Ha'amer ochalin, when you gather foods, im la'achila, the same differences apply. If it depends what the intent is, or to the extent of the intent will decide how much you have to gather. Im la'achila, if you did it with the intent of eating, shiro kigrogret, you have to gather the amount of a dried fig. If you gathered it to create fodder for an animal, shiro kimlo pigdi, you have to gather enough to fill the mouth of a goat. If it was for firewood, for cooking, or for warmth, the amount that would require you to be liable. When you gather, you have to gather enough to cook an egg. Now, when we say egg in halacha and Jewish law everywhere, what we mean is the average size egg produced by hens. And now, whenever we say to cook an egg, says the Rambam, don't think it means to cook the whole thing. It means it means enough time to cook the amount that would be fit for human consumption of the egg, which is a grogeret. So we say to cook an egg because typically you don't cook half an egg. But when you're cooking the egg, all we need to make you liable is that enough of the egg should be fit for human consumption, which is the shiur of a grogeret, of a dried fig. Ugrogeret. How big is a dried fig? Echad mishlosha bebeitza, 1/3 of an egg. And the Rambam says another rule: ve'ein imur ela begidulei karka. The whole melacha of gathering only applies to things which grow from the ground. You don't go around gathering books in your house and transgressing that melacha. It's only for foodstuffs. Later on, we'll see in the 20s, I believe it's chapter 22 or 21, the Rambam will say that even salt has this melacha. But other than that, only things which grow from the ground. I should point out, by the way, that the Noida B'Yehuda, Rabbi Yechezkel Landa, ruled that if you are in your field and part of gathering the produce also helps you clean up your field, so the same way we saw in the first halacha that when you do something liyapot et hakarka, to beautify the earth, you're liable on account of choresh, so over here also, you'd be liable on account of plowing your field. And when it comes to plowing, the minute amount could even be a kol shehu, even a tiniest amount. So you wouldn't need this whole list over here of depending on what you're doing it for. If you're gathering the bundles also with the intent of cleaning up your field, even the minutest amount makes you liable already. Halacha vav, we now move to other things that go into the category of imur. Hamekabez dvela, somebody who gathers dried figs, va'asam mimenu agula, and made a cake. Oshe nikav te'inim, or he pierced figs, v'yichnisa chevel bahen ad shenitkabtzu guf echad, and he ran a string through them till they became one long necklace. That's a derivative of me'amer, of this melacha, the chayav, and you're obligated, you're liable to punishment. And the same would apply to anything like it. Here we have the famous picture that came out actually just a short while ago, of this ancient jug, 3,000-year-old jug they found in Israel, with dried figs still strung, as they used to do it so many years ago. That's a cake of dried figs on the other side, but that's what the Rambam talking about over here. Nikav te'inim, you put a rope through them. That's right there. We have living testimony from thousands of years ago. And now the Rambam moves on to the next category of labor, which is disha, the melacha of threshing And the purpose of threshing essentially is once you have the bundles of grain, you had the animal walk over it to loosen, not fully separate, but to loosen the outside chaff from the kernels. The bad part of the stalk from the part that you actually wanted to get a hold of for your bread. Says the Rambam Hadash, when it comes to the threshing, kigrogeret chayav. The amount to make you liable is also like any other melachot related to eating, the amount of a dried fig. The ein disha ela begidulei karka. The melacha of threshing only applies to things that grow from the ground. And now the Rambam says a very important thing. Since the underlying principle of threshing is separating the chaff from the kernel, the hamifarek, anybody that detaches something from its shell, harehi toledat hadash v'chayav. You're a derivative of threshing and you're obligated on account of that. V'chein kol kayotze bazeh, anything like it. However, the commentaries do say that, let's say, onions or garlics and very hard shells of certain things, like walnuts, don't classify as mifarek. Mifarek is extracting something from a somewhat loose/hard shell. Another category that goes under this is hacholevet habehema, somebody who milks a cow. When you here's a peas in a pod, you see? That's extracting something from a shell. That would be an example of mifarek. Milking a cow, milking an animal, chayav mishum mifarek, holds you liable on account of extraction. V'chein hachovel. The Rambam just said that disha only applies to things that grow from the ground. So how could you have milking a cow hold you liable for mifarek? So the commentaries say because in the end of the day, the cow does grow from the ground because it nourishes itself from the ground. Others say because when it comes to the toladot, the derivatives, they don't have to follow the principles of the primary labor. The primary labor of disha is only for gidulei karka, things that grow from the ground. But when it comes to the derivatives, they don't have to follow those rules. And the commentaries do note that if there's tsar ba'alei chayim, if the animal is in pain, you could have a goy milk the cow on Shabbos. All right. V'chein hachovel b'chai sheyesh lo or. Somebody who wounds a living being that has halachic skin. We're going to soon see certain categories of living beings aren't considered to have a hide that's separate from their inside. But if you hit a living being that has a skin, chayav mishum mifarek, you would be liable on account of extraction. Vahu sheyetzadich ladam sheyetzei min hachabura, provided that you would require the blood for medicinal purposes or to feed an animal that's coming out of the wound. So if you made this wound on a person's hand and you needed to get the blood, we would hold you liable for doing the melacha. But if you simply wanted to damage the person, patur, you're exempt. Forbidden, but you're exempt. Because you go into the category of destructive labor. Way back in chapter 1 we saw that destructive labor never holds you liable. But both in the case of milking and in the case of wounding, the extracted liquid has to be enough to be considered important for eating, which is the size of the dried fig, as we've been seeing before. Should point out, the Ravid, one of the primary commentators on the Rambam, says when it comes to liquid, the measurements should be different. In general, in halacha, the shiurim, the amounts for eating and for drinking are always different. So here too, for Shabbat, we shouldn't consider drinks, liquid, in the same realm as food. The Rambam, however, does. Halacha ched b'med dvarim amurim. When are we talking about that there's a difference whether you wound for the blood or you wound simply to damage? That's only somebody who wounds an animal, a beast, or a bird. But somebody who wounds his friend, another human being, so this example of the hand wasn't really so accurate for the last halacha. It should be more in this halacha. Even if you had in mind to purposely damage him, chayav, we do hold you accountable. Because of the pleasure of your spirit. By wounding your friend, somewhat of your anger was calmed and cooled. And so in that way, you are doing something constructive. And therefore, even if you don't need the blood that you want to extract from him, you're liable. So let's recap, so I can correct myself. When it comes to animals, you wound an animal in the leg. It depends if you need the blood or not. If you need the blood, that's when you're liable. If you don't need the blood, you're simply damaging, then you're exempt. When it comes to a human being, whether you did it for the blood, whether you did it for just to get out some anger, you're going to be held accountable. Now we have the halakha tet shmoneh shratzim ha'amurim b'Torah. The 8 shratzim. We had this way before in the beginning of book 2, if you remember. There's 8 special rodents listed in the Torah: the choled, the weasel, achbar, the mouse, tzav, the toad, anaka, the porcupine, koach, the chameleon, lita'ah, the lizard, chomet, the snail, tinshemet, the mole. These 8 rodents, hen sheyesh lahen orot le'inyan Shabbat kemo chayal behema va'of. They are considered to have halachically qualifying hides when it comes to Shabbos laws, like any other beast, animal, or bird. And therefore, wounding them would subject you to these laws. If you did it for the blood, you would actually be held liable. But any other type of rodent or insect, they don't have halachic hide. Therefore, if you were to wound them, you'd be exempt. Okay, I see here, I wrote a note that the Shulchan Aruch says you're actually liable. The Rambam says, you're patur. Shulchan Aruch says you would be liable, not liable so much for the Melacha of Mifarek, which we're discussing now, the extraction, but for shchita, for taking away life, extracting the blood. Okay, in chapter 10 we're also going to deal with what if you have insects that are a threat to your life. It's a different story. If you wound an animal, beast, or bird, or any of the 8 rodents, and you made a wound, a blood clot, and blood came out, or a blood clot formed, even though the blood didn't come out, like a black and blue mark, you can see there's a bruise, chayav, that already makes you liable. Because that's where you've already extracted, according to the Rambam, the Melacha here is the extraction. You've removed the blood from its shell. One who squeezes fruits to get out their juice, chayav mishum mifarek, you are liable on account of extraction. But again, you have to squeeze out enough juice. That's considered important when it comes to eating. That's the amount of a dried fig. Biblically, we're only going to hold you liable for pressing olives and grapes. And even there, all the way on the right, you see the picture of the crushing of the grapes into a salad. That's okay. Liquid that's immediately reaching food is considered to be food. That's like extracting food from food, where there's no problem. But if you squeeze the grapes into a bowl or into a vessel, in this case a cup of wine, where there is no food, that qualifies as stepping, crushing the grapes, and you are obligated, you're liable for punishment. Somebody who milks a cow directly into food, or somebody who nurses with his own mouth, patur, you're exempt because it isn't the normal way of doing it. And you're only liable if you milk into a vessel. Now, when the Rambam writes milking into food, it's exempt. The commentaries all say that talking about festivals. The Rambam's leaving the laws of Shabbat for a second. He's going to festivals because on Shabbat it's a whole different law. Talking about nursing with the mouth, this brings up the question modern days, if you suck a fruit in your mouth, you suck out the juice, is that considered like nursing with the mouth and exempt or not? Many say it is like nursing with the mouth and you're exempt. Others say it's forbidden. The Rambam concludes with the line of milking into a vessel. So he contrasts milking into food and milking into a vessel. What is the Rambam adding when he says you're only obligated if you milk into a vessel? So the commentaries say if you milk directly onto the ground for no purpose, you're simply getting the milk out of the cow's system. So we can't make you liable for that. We'll keep you exempt. Halacha Yud Aleph, we now move on to the next Melacha, the next 2 Melachot. We have the Melacha of Zriyah, of winnowing, where you're taking, after the threshing has loosened the chaff from the kernel, you throw it to the wind and the chaff and kernel actually separate. And then you have Brira, which is sorting. And here in sorting is when you take the kernel itself and you either sort away the last pieces of chaff that might remain after the winnowing, or some say you sort the bran from the actual kernel. Because the kernel is also surrounded by a little peel. When you have whole wheat bread, whole grain, they keep the bran. But sometimes you want to have the bran separated. That's also called sorting. It says that Amam hazoreh o haborer, kigrogeret chayav. When you winnow or you sort, as long as you winnow or sort the amount that equals a dried fig, you're liable. Now mechabetz, and one who curdles milk, starts the process of making it into cheese. Harehu toledet borer. That's a derivative of sorting. You're sorting the whey from the curds. And the same thing is, if you were to sort the dregs, sediment of the wine, from the liquid, toledet borer, or, fascinating language from the Rambam here, or toledet meraket, or it's a derivative either of sorting or of sifting, which we haven't gotten to yet. We'll get there soon. V'chayav, and you're liable either way. Shahazoreh v'haborer v'hameraked domin inyanehem zeh lezeh, says the Rambam. We should know, even legally, the winnowing, the sorting, the sifting, the topics are all very similar. Why did we count them as 3 separate melachot? Only because the way we know what constitutes labor is because every unique labor that was done in the preparation of the Mishkan is counted as its own Melacha, even if in concept it's kind of hard to differentiate between them in many, many different ways. That's why many times when it comes to the derivatives, we can point them in a number of directions. This case, for example, of separating the dregs, the Rambam says it's either a derivative of borer or a derivative of meraked. But either way, it's totally forbidden. Halacha Yud Bet. Haborer ochel mitoch psolet. Somebody who sorts good things from the bad. You're taking for yourself that which you want, and you're leaving that which you don't want. Or you had two good types of food, you wanted both, and you simply sorted one from the other. If you were to do it in a sifter or a sieve, chayav, you'd be liable. That's literally the malacha of borer. But if you separated it by means of a different type of vessel that has little compartments or a big bowl, then you're exempt, because you didn't do it the normal way. A major caveat: if you sorted with your hands and you had intent to eat it right away, it's actually permitted. This is an important rule to remember when it comes to borer. The way we say it is miyad, biyad, ochel mitoch psolet. Miyad means immediately, biyad means by hand, manually, ochel mitoch psolet means the good from the bad. If you follow these three steps, you're allowed to sort on Shabbos. A, you're doing it for using right away. B, you're doing it manually, not with the help of a utensil. 3, you're taking the good from the bad, not vice versa, the bad from the good. You do these 3 things, you're off the hook. Everything else, all the halachot come in. If you sort the bad from the good, even with one hand, chayav, you are liable. If you sort the turmusin, the very tough beans, from their shell, chayav, you're also liable. Because their shell, what seems to be their throwaway parts, could actually be useful in the cooking process. It can sweeten them if you were to cook it with the beans. And so in a way, you're actually removing the bad from the good, because the shell is the good thing, it can enhance it, and that makes you liable. You took food, good from the bad, you did it manually, you fulfilled the last 2 conditions there, but you wanted to leave it. Even for later in the day, you become like one who sorts to put it in the storage house, and you are liable. If you had 2 types of food mixed up, you can pick one out from the other and put it aside, only to eat it right away. If you were to sort and leave it for later, even for the same day, you picked it in the morning to eat it in the afternoon, chayav, you are liable. Halacha Yudalet says that if you strain wine or oil or water or any other liquid, b'mishameret shalahen, in the normal strainer that's reserved for them. Here we have wine, homemade wine, being strained in a regular strainer. Chayav, you are liable on account of borer. You're picking out the good from the bad. V'husha yishamer kigrogeret, again, provided that you strain enough of the amount of wine that could fit in the size of a dried fig. Aval misanenin yayin she'en bo shmarim o mayim tzlulin. But if you have wine with no sediment, it's already clear somewhat, or water that's already clear, you can strain them if you do it in an abnormal manner, bisudarin ubikfifa mitzrit, through cloth or through a basket. There you see on the right the cloth, on the left you see the basket. So number 1, you're using an abnormal vessel. Number 2, the wine and the water are already mostly clear. Kedei sheyehei tzalul biyoter, so it can be even more clear. That's allowed. You can put water onto sediment, so they will become extra clear, and that's okay as well. You can put a beaten egg over mustard, a mustard strainer, to help it clear through. This was apparently a mechanism they used to use when they were straining mustard. They'd pour a raw egg over it, and it would help with the process. If you have mustard which you needed on Erev Shabbat, you can stir it the next day and drink it, whether with your hands or with a utensil. If you have wine straight from the press, as long as it's still fermenting and bubbling, you can mix the entire barrel and its sediment and pour it onto cloth. It isn't considered real borer. Why? Because at this point, while it's still fermenting, the sediment and the wine haven't really fully separated for you to be straining, for your straining to be considered a real straining. The whole wine is considered to be like one substance, and in one substance there is no law of picking. The same applies to mustard and anything like it. The reason why you can stir it and separate it is because it's one piece of matter in which the law of borer doesn't apply. Halakha tedvav, we now move on to the next melacha of tchina, grinding. Hatochen kigrogeret chayav, says the Rambam, if you grind the size of a dried fig, you are liable. Anybody who grinds any types of spices or herbs in a mortar and pestle, that's what you see over there. They used to have these tough bowls and this little tool that you bang the spices till they get crushed. That qualifies as grinding, and you are held liable. You saw this the other day as well. Somebody who cuts a detached vegetable into very thin slices, that's a derivative of grinding. And somebody who saws down wood in order to benefit from the sawdust, or somebody who files down a block of metal to use in his goldsmithing, as we saw the other day as well. In this case, you're liable the moment you saw down even the tiniest bit, because there's a usability even in the tiniest bit. When it comes to grinding actual food, you need to have the amount of eating, which is a dried fig. When it comes to using for other materials, even the minutest amount makes you liable. But if you're simply chopping wood, not sawing down the wood, typically when you chop wood, you're using it for cooking purposes. And so you have to chop enough wood to cook a dried fig's amount from an egg. Halakha Tet Zayin, we now move on to the next couple of melachot. One who sifts the amount of flour to fit in a dried fig, chayav, you are liable. Halash Kigro, the next one who needs the amount of a dried fig, makes you obligated. It's somewhat of an argument, what does it mean to need? Does needing mean the dried fig has to be made up of the water and the flour, or just the flour? Some commentaries say you have to have just a dried fig of just flour. Some say you have to have a dried fig size of the flour and the water together. Hamegabela ta'afar, one who mixes dust or mixes cement, harei toledat lash, that's a derivative of kneading. The kama shiuro, how much cement must be mixed, kedei la'asot pikur shel tzorfei zahav, enough to make a crucible for a goldsmith. The opening, the way they used to deal with gold, you can see there's some ancient pictures, maybe I'll show it a different day, how they used to deal with the gold. So the amount to cover this little kiln, little crucible. When it comes to ash, kneading isn't a legal thing. V'lo b'chol hagas, nor thick sand, v'lo b'mursan, nor with bran, v'lo b'chayotzei bahen, or anything like it. You put bran into water, that isn't considered kneading. But if you were to put sesame seeds or flaxseed into water, then since they do somewhat mesh with the water, you would be held liable on account of kneading, because they mix and they hang onto each other, becoming somewhat of a unified piece of dough, if you will, and that puts it already in the category of being a derivative of the melacha of kneading. And with this, we conclude the discussion on the first 10 melachot. See you tomorrow for the continuation of the list of the melachot and their derivatives.